Remember when you could get anywhere by train? I certainly don't. Atlanta was once the passenger rail capital of the South, with multiple major stations and hundreds of trains running each day. But now, this is all that's left. This weird tiny station 3 miles north of downtown, wedged between the interstate and a Freemason symbol. And unfortunately, it only serves one train a day, running one way in each direction between New York and New Orleans. It's strange, right? Most of the region's existing town centers originate from railroads, but now these tracks are simply just tourist attractions. Luckily, today I've partnered with the transit planner behind ATL Trains, Caleb Stubbs, who proposes a revolutionary regional rail plan for the region. We could transform the way people move for much cheaper than existing proposals. So let's find out. What happened to Atlanta's passenger rail, and is it time we bring it back? Getting into the history of railroads, I was astounded by all the details I came across online. This was a much bigger rabbit hole than I thought it'd be. So, let's get into it.
Most cities spring up around major waterways, such as rivers and harbors, which allow for places of trade, transportation, and obviously water. Downtown Atlanta is located about 5 miles southeast of the Patitucci River. This river is historically not very useful. It's unsuitable for trade and travel due to its shallow nature this far upstream.
Instead of waterways, Atlanta's railroads served this purpose, and the city grew around and eventually up and over the train tracks, embedding the railways into every aspect of the region's development.
In fact, the city's original name was Terminus, a name representing its importance as the South's premier railroad hub. The railroads were the waterway for the city, providing commerce, transportation, and the place where they converged in the heart of Atlanta eventually came to bear the name akin to a river, the Railroad Gulch.
And boy did people ride trains back then. At the height of passenger rail in Atlanta, it was amazing where you could go by train in the 1920s. One prime example is my hometown Marietta, Georgia. This town completely exists due to its passenger rail stop towards Atlanta. In fact, most of the region's OTP cities are situated along railroads. Their downtown districts right next to some 100 passenger rail stations littered around the metro Atlanta region.
With 90 regional rail-like local trains per day, you can get to most of the region's smaller cities, all by train from Atlanta. But even more astounding was the sheer amount of long-distance intercity options. There are nearly 30 long-distance passenger trains per day, connecting the cities across the United States. Today, we currently only have one intercity train per day, the Crescent, passing through Atlanta between New York City and New Orleans.
Behind me, across the strait from Five Point Station, used to stand Atlanta's first passenger rail station, Atlanta Union Station. Dating back to 1853, the station used to serve 30 to 40 trains a day. And here used to stand Atlanta's Grand Train Station, Atlanta Terminal Station, built in 1905. At its peak, it served over 90 trains a day. But now stands the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, which serves exactly 0 trains a day. Both were beautiful historic buildings that were demolished in 1972. So what led to the rapid decline of railroading during this period? Well, after some research, the answer kind of surprised me.
The demise of U.S. passenger rail by the 1970s was a long, winding road that largely tracked to the rise of the automobile and airline industries. While technically private companies, roads were the first industry in the U.S. to be regulated by the federal government, which they did from 1887 all the way to 1980. And up until the 1920s, while freight was the railroad company's bread and butter, passenger rail was profitable to the railroads because it really was a premier way to travel, and there really was no competition.
Local passenger trains were the first to fall out of favor with the public, as more Americans bought cars like the Model T Ford and decided to drive those routes instead.
There was a short-lived resurgence in the mid-40s because of gas rations during World War II, but of course that did not last as they mostly disappeared by 1950. Long-distance trains stuck around a few years longer, driven by a massive federal investment in sleek streamliners after the war, but by the 1960s, they had fallen out of favor due to the rise of passenger jets and airports. Passenger rail ticket prices increased rapidly due to the decreased demand, and after World War II, the deteriorating railway infrastructure across the U.S. made it difficult for railways to modernize train travel and compete with the airplane and interstate highways. It wasn't just limited to passenger trains either. During the post-World War II boom, many railroads went bankrupt and were driven out of business by tight regulations and competition from airlines, cars, and the burgeoning trucking industry.
The nail in the coffin was the Interstate Highway Defense Act of 1956, which practically killed passenger rail for Americans, as the passenger and freight companies just couldn't compete with cheap gas, cheap cars, and fast new expressways that started to be constructed across the second half of the century.
Eventually, most rail companies would go bankrupt, as regulation made it more difficult for the railroads to compete. In response, President Nixon nationalized the passenger rail industry through the Rail Passenger Service Act and nationalized the industry into Amtrak on May 1, 1971, in order to take the burden of passenger services off of the freight companies. The federal government consolidated all of the bankrupting northeastern freight companies into Conrail and eventually deregulated the railroads by 1980 through the Staggers Act. Unfortunately, it was really too late for the railroads. Americans fell in love with the car, and by this time, interstate highways and air travel made these transportation modes way more convenient for most Americans.
So by 1970, with Atlanta's former illustrious passenger rail stations closing, Atlanta's railroad gulch dried up and became increasingly less useful and more so disruptive and unattractive. Luckily, in recent years we've seen a strong resurgence in interest in train travel, as airplanes get more expensive and traffic chokes our region.
As a result of the Biden administration's bipartisan infrastructure law passed in 2021, 5-year funding for transit expansion went up to $39 billion, while funding for passenger and freight rail went up to $66 billion for the next 5 years.
This is huge because this is the first time the federal government has made a significant investment in a comprehensive national rail plan in a very long time.
Atlanta is seeing money to fund Amtrak routes from Memphis through Nashville and Chattanooga and continuing on to Savannah. Additionally, funding for a high-speed rail route through Athens to Charlotte is funded as well through a corridor ID program.
Now, it's important to note that this isn't putting any shovels in the ground. This is strictly for planning and research efforts. However, it's pretty exciting to see federal interest in the Atlanta region, which means there's an easy opportunity to revolutionize transport for the Atlanta Metro. For this video, I'm excited to partner with Caleb Stubbs, a transit planner who has spent the past 4 years crafting an innovative regional rail plan for the Atlanta Metro, ATL Trains. With a 145-page white paper, the project has generated lots of buzz among transit nerds in the area. He proposes a 300-mile regional rail system that will leverage existing rail infrastructure, investing in and expanding it to optimize the movement of people and freight.
The ATL Trains vision is all about implementing all-day bi-directional regional rail service, serving the estimated 82% of the region's existing activity centers that lie within a half-mile of a railroad corridor.
Since building new tracks on existing corridors slashes capital costs by over 80% of that of building new tracks from scratch, regional rail offers all of the proven benefits of conventional rail transit for a cost comparable to BRT.
He proposes 90 stations along 11 regional rail lines that converge onto a so-called central corridor through downtown Atlanta, Atlanta's west side, and to the Atlanta airport. The same corridor that brought in 120 passenger trains per day into Atlanta 1 century ago. The plan will connect 12 counties with proper rail services, and since most town centers already exist on historic rail lines, it would revitalize downtowns across the region, while complementing the existing public transportation networks of MARTA, Cobb Link, Bright Gwinnett, and more.
Most importantly, is the restoration of a downtown train station located right here in the Gulch, right where Atlanta's historic downtown train stations once stood, either in the Centennial Yards project that's planned for the area, or through adaptive reuse of the Omni. The station could serve as a regional hub for the entire Southeast, and allow for easy transfers to Amtrak, MARTA Rail, bus, and streetcar services. What's so interesting about this project, though, is that economically, it actually could be quite financially feasible with the right political support.
By leveraging and expanding existing railroad corridors over assembling brand new ones, the ATL Trains vision offers an upfront cost savings of upwards of 80% per mile compared to expanding the existing MARTA rail system, while being capable of providing competitive levels of service. Additionally, minimal right-of-way would be needed since it would stay almost entirely within an existing freight right-of-way. In theory, the 13 counties could fund the project with a single 0.5% 30-year transit SPLOST tax, which would use the Atlanta Region Transit Link Authority, the ATL, as its operator. This circumnavigates constitutional roadblocks that come with using authorities such as MARTA as its operator, and enables greater flexibility in funding sources.
The biggest roadblock in general rail investment here is the freight companies, along with the state government.
For example, Clayton County recently joined MARTA, Atlanta's transit authority, and promised regional rail service throughout the county to connect into the MARTA system. However, due to the lack of compliance with the freight rail companies, Clayton County and MARTA were unable to reach any sort of agreement on the project. Now, MARTA is proposing bus rapid transit for the county. And honestly, it's a bit of a laughable project looking at it. The route just doesn't make any sense for BRT, and while some bus lanes will help this route, it's so winding and not at all what MARTA promised Clayton County.
Historically, the best chance of working with the freight railroads is through the state government. But the Georgia State DOT has never been very supportive of transit in the region.
This is because it's constitutionally prohibited for state gas tax revenues to fund anything but roads, and therefore, Georgia DOT has never given a cent to MARTA in its lifetime. People often ask why MARTA sucks, but really, it was set up from the beginning to struggle, and lacking state support makes it really difficult to build regional projects that compare to other states in the country, as we pretty much always need federal funding.
The key here is that passenger rail investment can be a win-win for both passenger and freight services.
Often, politicians make out that passenger rail services will impede on freight operations. However, this simply isn't the case. ATL Trains details how investment benefits both parties, through dramatically expanding capacity, eliminating bottlenecks, improving network fluidity, and more. Nearby states, such as North Carolina, are taking rail expansion seriously, and since their state DOTs invested in improving Amtrak service through the NC by Train program, they've seen intercity ridership increase 23% since 2022, and have many improvements in the pipeline. They face the exact same challenges we do here in Georgia, gaining state support and working with the freight companies. They're doing exactly what ATL Train proposes, improving rail operations for both passenger and freight.
I hope you all enjoyed the video. Go ahead and leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you think of ATL Trains. I personally think it's really exciting. Thank you again to Caleb Stubbs for working with me, and I'll see y'all next time. See ya.